any second now, we're going to be live on Facebook. So we can assume we are live on Facebook now, and I'll start the recording on here. If I can find it again. There we go. Okay, so we're all set, and welcome, Amy. It's lovely to see you. And thank you for being
here. Thank you.
So for those people who don't know very much about you, which we're hoping there are going to be people watching this who don't know anything about you, for me, the best place to start, I think, is just to talk about your story, about where you come from, what this is about for you, and then we can go from there.
For those of you who don't know, I don't know if there are people who are brand new to the three principles watching this, so that would be like a whole nother part of the discussion. I was born to a father and a mother who got divorced quite early when I was 3 years old. And then my father, when he got out of grad school, he went to Eugene, Oregon, and he was director of the Lane County Mental Health Center. His name was Roger Mills. And while he was directing the Lane County Mental Health Center, he actually had custody of me. So I was around for most of this, and I would go see my mother in the summer times and so forth. And I'm also hearing a bit of an echo. I wonder if people can mute themselves, or I'm not sure. It's a little tiny echo, but I'll just keep going as that's getting sorted. So my father, through a sort of a chain of events that's been described elsewhere, ended up going to meet a man named Sidney Banks on Salt Spring Island in Canada, in British Columbia. And at that time, he was profoundly impacted by Sidney Banks, and he thought that what Sidney Banks was saying could have an impact on his clients that he was working with at the Lane County Mental Health Center. And one of his concerns was that people were not really getting better. They were sort of they would get better maybe and then come back and sort of loop around. So recidivism, right? And he was just so touched by what Sidney Banks said. And, and observing him as I was able to do as a child, what I saw was that he was first grappling with his own ego, actually, and this is what we've called the health of the helper, that people actually, before they can run out and go start saving the world, it's like, well, save yourself first, right? Then you can tell us how to do it. But if you don't know how to do it, you can't tell us how to do it, right? So in my mind, this paradigm that we speak of, the three principles, is always about what we ourselves are learning first, right? And that's what I'm hoping to share on this webinar too, is what my experience has been with depression and anxiety recently, and with psychotropic medications. And then I can only share what I learned from that. So at any rate, my father, I just saw him change. He became less kind of like egotistical and less, he could be very kind of sarcastic. He could be, he always liked to joke around. He was very social, very much an extrovert. I think I picked that up from him. And he just sort of calmed down. He was more willing, I think, to be quiet and to not be the center of attention, and just to sort of, and he's told this story too. He's passed away now, but he's written this, and he'll say that he started to value a quiet mind, because Sidney Banks would talk about getting your mind quiet, or just sort of coming in or stumbling into a quiet space, which is where innate mental health really lies. And we'll be talking, I guess, about innate mental health. So it's important to sort of have a definition of what that is. And it really is, for most of us, we can think back on moments where our minds just became quiet, or we had a positive thought and suddenly there was a little opening, if we were in the midst of a lot of anxiety and depression, a little opening of peace, And that's going to be important later on in this conversation, because those positive thoughts, even while fleeting, are very important. I've found just incredibly important. We don't think they are because they come and go, but they're so important. At any rate, so I grew up with my father, listening and learning from Sydney Banks. And then I went on to college. I became a journalist. My father was doing all this work in communities, some of it quite famous, work at Modelo and low income housing projects with incredible results. And, he was a real go-getter. And he did a lot of tremendous work in communities and with foundations and with city governments and county governments. He really got a lot of that work going and rolling, and saw great successes. I can't even tell you the people that he worked with, and then eventually I got on board because I had been through a period of depression in my 20s, and it made me curious. I was a journalist at the time and writing for newspapers and so forth. And as I went through depression and I started to wonder about the power of the human spirit versus medication and what the medical community was saying about depression, it just intrigued me so much, the difference between what I was hearing my father say and the medical community. And so I wrote an article eventually, and this was after I came out of the depression. And to be honest, for those of you who suffer from depression, like in that early depression, before I was completely sort of past it, I didn't want to talk about it, actually, because I was afraid of the thoughts in my own mind. If I started to think too much about it, it would start to take me into this very bad place. And so it took me probably a few years to get to a place where I felt like I could talk about it, think about it, be around it, and not be impacted. And I want to share that happened for me. And that was without any medication. Actually, the medications actually were coming out when I wrote the article, which is why I wanted to write it, because Prozac was coming out. The selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors were coming out, and everyone was so excited, and everyone was saying, this must be chemical. It must be brain chemistry that causes this, because it's chemistry that's fixing it. Although we could argue how much it's being fixed by these medicines. And for some people, it really has been fixed by these medicines. But then there's another question about the placebo effect, right? So the placebo effect is quite strong with some of these medications, like 40 to 60%, meaning that people are taking a sugar pill and being told it's going to help them with their depression, and it's working. So that speaks very strongly to the power of thought and a sense of surrender for me, like in terms of, okay, I'm taking a pill so I can just stop thinking about it so much. I'm just going to take this pill and try to relax and just take a breath. And look, if you didn't take the pill and you said that would help. Do you see what I'm saying? I can stop trying to fix it so much. Now, there's more to come, because I went through another period of depression, which I just mentioned on my own Amy Chen Coaching Facebook page. I don't think I talked about it with you, Anne. And this would be the first time I have talked about it, which was a period of depression and anxiety, like literally 7 months ago, for almost a year, I'd say. And so that I'd like to talk about too, because I did take medication at that time. And I was a principal teacher, but I also had children to take care of, and I just had to buck up and just say, I'm just going to. So there's just so much at play here in terms of how we think about whether we should take medication. What does it mean to take medication? Our self-image and medication. Sorry, I think I said meditation. Medication or psychotropic drugs. And I'll be very honest too about psychotropic drugs. I'd like to speak about both the traditional drugs, which I can't speak too much about. People like Bill Pettit know a lot more about their actions and what they do in the brain and for the body. But there are also the new psychotropic, they're not new at all, the new psychotropic psychedelic drugs that are being tested for depression and anxiety, including also MDMA. And so that's a whole nother realm of that we could look into. I've only looked into it just a bit, but it's enough for me to have an opinion. Which is not hard for me to have an opinion. So, and I think it's something that we don't talk about quite properly sometimes, or with the right openness of attitude in not just the three principles community, but in spiritual communities in general, where we're expected to sort of be realized from within and to just sort of be sparkly and happy and or contented all the time. So going back to my bio, I ended up writing this article on depression. That got me into a training program in Santa Clara County on the three principles. I did that for several years and then worked for the county for several years in the jails with kids in juvenile hall, with county employees, with probation officers, social workers, public members of the public who would come to the trainings, and in the work furlough programs and so on. And then my father and I started the Center for Sustainable Change, which was a nonprofit. And I worked there as the director for 10 years. And we worked with the Kellogg Foundation and the San Francisco Foundation and the Shin Yuen Foundation. And we did a tremendous amount of work in low income communities across the country and in hospital systems and government systems as well. So anyway, that's sort of my background. And if there's particular questions about my recent past, or I'm just happy to be of service at this time.
There don't seem to be any questions just at this moment, but that's really interesting to hear all of that, Amy. But and I can't wait to get on to what you're going to talk about now, because I it just reminded me of one time when years and years ago, when I was a doctor and I had trained in psychosexual medicine. I was a sexual and relationship therapist, and my husband left me, and I had no idea how, like, what on earth does this mean? And
You were a relationship, did you say sexual and relationship therapist?
Okay. Just as I qualified, my husband left me, right? But during the next 2 years, because I was also training in general psychotherapy, I was going to see a psychotherapist every week for 2 years, and I still had no clue, what had gone wrong, where I should go, what was going on. I had no idea. But during that time, what was really interesting was that I'm aware that I kept myself unhappy because I thought if I didn't, it would show that I didn't really love him. Right. So I had these thoughts that were telling me I should keep myself unhappy. But there were times, it was just that glimpses that you mentioned. I learned, I decided to do some things that I had always wanted to do and had never got around to doing. So I learned to sail. And I would go sailing, and I would come home at the end of the day, and I would be in my car driving along thinking, oh, I feel so good. I've had such a good day. And then I would think to myself, hang on a minute, that can't be right. I can't be feeling happy because I'm depressed.
Yes, and I'm just going to say here that some people can't even get it together to go sailing.
Yeah,
like if you were able to go sailing, like, and you know this as a therapist, I'm sure that like even going to take a class in sailing, and that's already relatively high functioning for some people.
Yeah. But it was just interesting to me that I was convinced I was depressed, and yet I was actually, there were days when I was really happy. I was like, oh, how does that work? I don't get that. Now it makes sense to me, of course, but then it didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also the other thing that you mentioned was, because you're going to be talking about medication and where that fits in and so on, is I see that so much actually with people who have cancer and people who have all sorts of other, and pain, for example, and oh, I shouldn't be taking pain medication because I understand where it's coming from. Well, yeah, it's still pain. It's still, there's nothing wrong with taking medication for it. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about your experience.
All right, so how about if I go into my recent experience? And
That would be
I'm going to try to be careful because I have a family that was involved, and this is a public webinar, and I guess it's on Facebook as well. So I'm just going to try to be a little bit careful, but I'll do the best I can. So um, let's see. After the 2016 election, I think going on to 2017, the 2016 election is a huge marker in my life here in the United States, probably for obvious reasons. At any rate, uh, it was very upsetting for a lot of people. It was emotionally upsetting, and people in Europe may not understand, or maybe they do, how devastated people were. I mean, people were, we were having to kind of pick people up off the ground. I mean, people were shattered. And not everyone, of course, not people who voted for Donald Trump, but people who sort of had followed Donald Trump and sort of understood his background, Um, and at any rate, I think that sort of contributed to a sense for me of, because I'd been an activist in college, of I kicked into my activist nature, which I don't want to deny that part of myself that's an activist. And so, but I also was pretty concerned because I was looking at the news reports, and it just was, I mean, I was seeing hate crimes increase, which we've now seen incredible rise of hate crimes. We've doubled the amount in this last year of violence against Jews. Then last year, double the amount of violence against Jews. And most of the people who are committing these hate crimes will refer, or not most of them, but several of them have referred to Donald Trump as sort of being an inspiration of some kind, So, and that's true for Black people as well. And that's true for obviously the indigenous populations who are, trying very hard to prevent these oil pipelines from being built and so on. So there's just so much going on. And the more you look into it, the more kind of horrified you can become, at least from my perspective, right? So I think I was already a little bit edgy and concerned about my country. Also knowing that the United States is such a powerhouse in the world and has also been a beacon of, as 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 many weaknesses as we do have, a beacon of democracy, a beacon of freedom of speech, and civil rights and women's rights. I mean, and a lot of other countries too have had wonderful movements in that regard. But all of that, I sort of felt like was at risk, that reputation and that capacity to be a beacon in the world. And so it struck me very profoundly, and I think it contributed to some problems in my relationship with my husband. And I started to we just weren't getting along very well. And this is after 20. I think we've been together for 20 something years, on and off in the beginning before our wedding, but almost 30 years of life together, and 2 children as well. And towards the end of that time period, I don't remember exactly when that would be, maybe winter of 2017 or winter of 2017, beginning of 2017, I started to think about switching to the positive. Like, I started to think about it like, we should just start to be positive with each other. But at that point, my husband was pulling away, kind of like you, Anne, and like just sort of being gone and staying out late and not really wanting to talk about anything, not wanting to see a counselor, not just sort of trying to really, in hindsight, protect himself in the best way that he knew how, which wasn't the way that I would have preferred to do it, but it was what made sense to him at that time. And so we ended up actually separating. And I think I thought initially it was a good idea, but after it happened, I really, with 2 kids, ages 12 and at the time 14, it was 11 and 14, I think at the time. I saw the effect on them immediately, and I was like, no, this is not good. And I had already been thinking along the lines of how could I change really, because I'll say that in the principles, being immersed in the principles has helped me in so many areas of my life. But I will say that relationship is one area that I had found very tough. Like it just wasn't, there were some thoughts that were not looking like thoughts to me. And I know this is true for a lot of people because intimate relationships are very challenging, to the ego in particular. And so at any rate, we separated. I was in shock. And then we thought we'd probably get back together, and that was sort of where we were, I think, wanting to go. But my reaction was started to get very fearful because I saw the kid. There's something about being a mother and seeing your kids sort of suffering and then I started to think it was all my fault. And, I want to say one thing that I forgot to mention. There was a point at which in our relationship where I made a prayer. And my prayer was, I want to know the truth. Like I didn't know if we should be together or not be together. I had seen people stay together and be happy after changing, and I'd seen people separate and be happy and happier with a new person. And so I didn't know. I didn't have a rule in my head about what was the thing to do, right? And in the principles, there's a tendency to think people should stay together. But I know several people who've divorced in the principles or separated and found new partners and been happier. Now, it'd be nice to know their story more deeply about, like, did they change and that's why they were able to be happy with another person, or do they think the personality was different? To me, it's still a bit of a mystery. But so I didn't have any rules, and so I just said I pray for the truth to come out in our relationship. And this is when all the shit hit the fan. Like literally, the shit hit the fan, and for the first time, I was in a position where I felt like my whole life and everything that I sort of had built in my life, my family, our home together, that we actually built together. I mean, we literally have built this with our bare hands together, and the garden, and even the sense of having a role in society as a married woman. People who get separated or divorced can tell you, like, wow, there's something there that when you lose it's like you're in a different territory. And if you don't really come to understand your innate well-being, your innate mental health, it's a loss, because we do have this sort of subconscious thinking about married people, sort of like that. And we sort of give them a lot of respect for staying together for so long, even when they're miserable sometimes, right? So anyway, just a whole bunch of thinking that I didn't even know that I had came to the surface. And it came to the surface in the face of possibly losing all of this. And it made me very fearful. And then when I became fearful, I thought, well, I can't help anyone with my coaching or anything like that because I'm not doing very well. And, talk about the health of the helper, and I didn't have an interest in helping people. And then I thought, my goodness, like this, what do you do when you've been teaching the principles for 20 years? And I don't have a therapy degree. I don't have a master's degree. I've just been teaching the principles for 20 years. I have a lot of experiences, right? I have a lot of experience teaching and being in community and working with lots of different kinds of people and speaking and writing. But it's not like you're an engineer working for some company, right? And then you get fired or something, or you quit. And then you just go look for another company. That's not what I was looking at. I was looking at, oh, maybe this is over. And so that was an interesting thought. And so it was like my home, my family, my source of income, my career, everything was threatened, like all at once. So many parts of my identity. And I wish I could say, boy, but I knew the principles, so I just sort of rose to the occasion and realized that none of that mattered. I just found my innate well-being and I was okay. And I told the kids they'd be okay and we were all okay. That's not what happened. That is not what happened. What happened was I sort of went into a fear spiral, particularly around my children. And the more fearful I got around the children, because they were also going to junior high school, which is a tough age for them, and then dealing with all of this, which of course made them sad. And then the more I got in that cycle, of course, the more when I would speak to my husband, it was like out of a feeling of sort of like desperation and not like rational, calm conversations about things, right? Or letting him have his freedom, which was apparently what he needed at the time. And I'm not going to say that I'm the only one to blame, because he certainly was going through his own insecurities and midlife crisis and aging, and just he had all kinds of thoughts going on for him as well. And so this time period lasted for about a year, I'd say. And I got to a place where I realized I was so anxious. I wasn't sleeping because I also didn't know what was happening because we hadn't made a decision. And that's a very hard place to be at, this sort of limbo, And yet I didn't want to move forward with a divorce because that's not what I wanted. And I didn't know how to, get my husband to come back, and so I was completely at a loss. The future looked completely dark to me in terms of the unknown. And also I didn't want to go out and date, and I wasn't really interested in that. And so I found myself in a very dark place. And some people may relate to this, which is just like talking about like going sailing, as you mentioned. Like, no, like getting even registered for that would have been too much of an effort. I think I somehow started looking for jobs, like, because I wanted to feel like I could support myself. And so I interviewed for a few. I was volunteering at an environmental group, but I literally would go into this environmental group and like barely be holding it together. Like, it was just good for me to maybe focus on some research or something I was doing for them. But in terms of feeling lighthearted or having conversations or bonding with people, like none of that was really happening, Although probably from my perspective, it wasn't, whereas other people probably be like, oh, you were fine, because they didn't know what was happening inside of me, except that I probably didn't have the best energy, So I ended up, okay, so what's important about this time period? I would say that there were little things that occurred to me to do. And this is where I mean, like, these little positive thoughts would come in. So one of them was like, I wanted to get on medication. I was sort of like, I don't care. I don't care what the Three Principles community thinks about medication. I don't care what the spiritual community thinks about medication. I don't care what God thinks about medication. I just want something that will help me get back to a sense of presence and being able to be with my kids, because my state of mind was even freaking them out, I think, or upsetting to them. So I ended up going to see a psychiatrist, and I was prescribed a couple of medications. One was like, I think an SSRI, like Celexa or something. I don't remember exactly. And I think it was that. And the other one was pretty heavy duty, which is an anti-anxiety med called Ativan, which is a benzodiazepine, right? And I found in taking those that the Celexa was, I couldn't tell if it was working or not, but I knew when I took the benzodiazepine that I was way more like, a meteor could be hurtling toward the earth. And I'd be like, oh, that's okay. We're all good. Let's not stress. And so it was very effective, right? But I'm also a journalist and a researcher, as I've sort of mentioned, and I'm really good at looking things up. And so I ended up getting online, and the stories about benzos were just freaking me out. And I'd also gotten some advice from colleagues about you shouldn't be on those for too long. Those are kind of dangerous. You can get addicted. And then I saw these stories online where it was just craziness. And so I became very afraid of taking them. And yet I didn't want to stop taking them because they really helped me feel like myself again a little bit. Right. And and that was enough to sort of I got a job. I decided that given my state of mind, my husband's apartment wasn't big enough for the kids, so they were with me all the time. And I needed to have them be with their dad and have them be with just a different personality because I knew that I wasn't in the best shape. So I ended up renting a room. And here's something that, just sort of speaks to that inner wisdom is I thought I need a space to go to, but I don't want to be all by myself because I'd been feeling very alone. And I want a roommate or roommates that I can sort of be with and share community with. And I'd like to be able to bring my dog with me because we have a little dog. And I'd like it to just be a warm, loving environment and a nice environment. So I looked on Craigslist and I went to a couple of places to look at, and none of them, I mean, actually, two of them, the men there were hitting on me. I was just like barely functioning. I was like, are you kidding me? And then another one was just not, big empty space and people in their rooms kind of siloed off. It's just a weird vibe. And so I sat down and I wrote a description of what I wanted. And I put it on Craigslist and I said, this is what I'm looking for. I'm going through a hard time, and I'm looking for a room. And I got almost immediate reply from a woman who said, I'm down by the harbor where the boats are in my town. And I'm retired and I'm home a lot and I like to cook and I like to share food. And I think this might work out. She said, I know you want it to be on the west side of town, which is where I live and my kids go to school. But she said, I think you should come. So I went to talk with her. And again, I'm barely holding it together. I was trying not to take the benzos until later in the afternoon. I was trying to space them out so I wasn't taking them all the time. And I went to meet with her and I drove into, and this is interesting, it was a mobile home park. And I don't know what you call them in England. I think there's a different name. Is it mobile home?
Yeah, mobile homes, and this is ones that are static.
Yeah, I mean, they're different ones, right? Some still have the wheels and some of them are like homes, but a mobile home park in the United States is like your last step before homelessness or something. It's like, I mean, they can be nice and lovely and people have gardens and fix them up, but it's not considered like a home, right? Like with land.
Yeah.
And so here I am driving into the mobile home park and I'm thinking, and here I am coming from a nice house in one of the better parts of town, which is now worth a gazillion dollars because we're in California on the coast. It wasn't when I bought it, but now. And I'm driving into a mobile home park and I'm thinking, wow, like you really have hit rock bottom, Amy. Like this is it. Mobile home park, next stop, right? And then I found the house and it was really a lovely charming home. And the woman was sitting in this lovely garden, which is tiny, right next to the parking area, but just a lovely garden. And we talked for a while. And she mentioned this spiritual center that she goes to. And it was something I was interested in. And, because in the Three Principles world, often we're a little disconnected because we don't have churches and we're not meant to have churches. And that's wonderful. And yet for people who don't have a religion, because some people go to synagogue and learn the principles too, or go to church and learn the principles too, or go to, I don't know, a yoga studio and learn the principles too. There's something about community and social connection that I have found very important. And one of the reasons that I think I went into a depression is because I had not been nurturing community in my life. I was so busy being a mom and being a practitioner of the principles and writing and doing Zoom meetings all the time, which is what we're doing now, that I really hadn't reconnected with old friends much. I wasn't strengthening those friendships, and I wasn't making new friendships in the community. So she told me about the Center for Spiritual Living, which is a science of mind community, which is actually quite similar to the principles. It's more ritualistic, slightly, and also a little bit more sometimes geared towards like what you can get for yourself, but not really. That's not really the core. The core of it is mind as a principle for them. Same principle. God, the energy of all things, and thought and consciousness are very, very much at the forefront of what they're speaking to. So I ended up moving in with this woman, and part-time, and then I would come back to the house, and my husband and I would do this thing called nesting. So the kids are at home, and then he goes to his apartment, I come, and then I go to my room, and he comes, and we did that for quite a while. And at the same time, I started going to this Center for Spiritual Living, and they were speaking to the same things the principles were speaking to. But I want to say that, and I say this for people who are going through depression and anxiety and other terrible states of mind, that when people are talking about, let's say, oneness, or when people are talking about being of service in the world and or connecting and understanding other people's points of view, like that's all at a level that's assuming that you're already functioning at a certain level. Like that you're going to be, I want to listen to other people's points of view. I was at a stage where I was like, I just want to feel like myself again. That's all I want. I don't care about other people's points of view. I don't care about politics or what's happening with Donald Trump or the world. I don't care about anything except for trying to feel a little bit better. And so I was taking the medications. I ended up getting a job. That was helpful too, to be out and about and doing things. And those were all just little insights that I had, which was my wisdom guiding me in the world of form. So I think we can sometimes have the misunderstanding that with the principles, it doesn't matter what your form is. You should be able to, like that, like a light bulb going off, just suddenly feel all this well-being and be almost enlightened. Now, that's a possibility for anyone at any time, because we are connected to mind, and mind is us. However, for most people, sometimes a change of form is important, and it relates to helping our well-being to emerge. So for example, it was important for me to get out of my head and go do stuff in the community. And I was on medication, so that was helping me to go kind of be stable and go out. And because I would try to take the medications later in the afternoon, I remember having thoughts like driving to work. I actually had it was a fun job at this, we have Medi-Cal in the United States, Medicare and Medi-Cal in California, which is the sort of free medical service for poor people or people who don't make a certain amount of money. And it's great. We need more of that, obviously. It's a shame that we don't have that. We need that for everyone. But I would be driving to work. So I was doing communications and writing articles and doing the newsletter. And that was good work for me. And I would drive to work in the morning, and I would have a moment maybe of like, just looking at the trees, or it's just some positive few minutes amidst this anxiety, because I still didn't know what was happening with my husband. I didn't know, he didn't know, and he was confused, and it was just a mess. And I would say to myself, like, oh, look, there's that one moment. And sometimes that was all I had to hang on to. And I would look online at people who were using like the benzos, and there'd be one person or two who'd be like, you know what, I've been on benzos all my life and I'm fine. And I'm so glad I found them. I'm doing great. And I'd be like, wow, okay, so that's also possible. Or then someone who said, I was on them when I went to college because I was struggling you know, and I was on them for a year, and then I got off because I got better. And it was just a matter of fact. I was on them for a year, and then I got better and I got off. And so when I was very scared about getting addicted to them. I was very scared about being on them in general. I didn't like the idea that, oh my gosh, if I ran out of pills, or being sort of reliant on your doctor, to that now your doctor's in charge of your well-being. Because they can prescribe, and in particular with this class of drugs, like, they're very reluctant to continue you on them, and so they'll sometimes say things like, well, we got to start thinking about getting you off, and maybe you're not ready. And it's like, that's terrifying for someone who's come from a state of sort of anxiety and inner terror to begin with, right? So I can just see how we just so need to shift our conversation and our whole view of how to present these drugs to people and how to talk about them, because there's the one view, which is like, you are either on the drug or you're not. And if you're on the drug, then you obviously need the drug, and you're really not going to probably be able to get off, right? Or, we don't need any drugs at all. We're just going to, overcome our thinking and get spiritual, and we're going to be great and we're going to be happy. But there's a middle ground, and that middle ground is that the drugs can be a very effective help and tool. And we keep looking at our thoughts. We keep looking at thought. We keep looking at the principles. We keep believing that we have mental health underneath the medications and their effects, as well as underneath all the fearful thinking that we're doing. So I hope that in this webinar, I can bring that voice to the discussion, which is, and for me to even admit that I was on medication after literally being a principal's teacher for 20 something years, at this point, I have to say that being humbled across the board, which I was, going into this whole separation and depression and anxiety, brought me to my knees. But the good part about it is that I just don't really care anymore. Because I don't care anymore I let go of being a practitioner. That doesn't mean I'm not a practitioner. It means I just don't care anymore. What I care about is telling the truth as I see it. Right? And that's what we should all be doing. Because we tend to get into a habit of, like, what is everyone else saying? Right? And I should be in alignment with what everyone else is saying. And if I disagree, I'll pretend to be in alignment with what everyone else is saying, because that's how I get accepted into a group, and that's how it helps my career, and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that we don't listen to people who have obviously a very stable, loving, let's say, level of consciousness, for lack of a better term. It doesn't mean we don't question our egos when we get argumentative, right? It just means that when we know that there is a wisdom in us that's very organic, like, that's our guru, that's our teacher, more than anything else. And I had to throw everything away and just be like, what makes sense to me? Even going to a quote unquote church, Center for Spiritual Living, seemed like a little bit sacrilegious according to the principles. Like, why would you need to go to a church if you already have the principles? But I did need to go to a church. I went in this one in particular, Center for Spiritual Living, because what I found there was love and support and positivity. And so after these sort of beautiful sermons, I would meet with practitioners, and I would be completely humble, and I would just speak to them in private, and they would sit there and they would pray for me in their own way, or they would offer me suggestions from a very principles-based kind of perspective too. And one of them in particular, Elijah Christopher, I'll use his name because I just love him, and he's a minister at Center for Spiritual Living, and he's this wonderful kind of goth young man with like big black boots and a big long overcoat. And unlike a lot of the other people at the church, who are mostly women my age and older, And I met with him and he said, you need to tell your own story about the medication. You're getting online and you're seeing all these stories, but you tell your own story. And that struck me and that stayed with me. And so I started to tell my own story, which was, this is what you need right now, and stop worrying about it. Just stop worrying about it. Just put your mind on, and I'd have to remind myself to do that because I would worry about it. And so what else? So then I actually started dating a little bit and went out with a couple of men, and I actually liked them quite a bit. And it wasn't so much that the individual men were important as much as it's kind of fun. There are other people in this world. That was sort of important for me to understand. And then my husband was not, he was confused and lost and whatever. And I finally just said, okay, look, I can't stay in this room in a mobile home park. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because part of my lesson was like, you actually can live in a mobile home park. You can live on the street. You can live anywhere. And if you don't think that it's bad, it's not bad. So to be with a woman who actually had been divorced when her children were much younger, just ages ago, who was a happy, contented, spiritual person living in a mobile home park was important to me, for me to see that and get that. And I met all these other older single women too, who were quite happy and independent and actually, wouldn't want a man, even if someone paid them to have a man around. No offense to men. So I hope they're not taking offense. So where was I in the story? So then my husband and I had a couple of investment properties in Hawaii, and I thought, well, let's just sell one, and then I can get my own place. And I'm going to start talking to my friend who's an attorney, and we're going to do permanent separation or divorce, whatever. I just need this to end. Like, I need to move on. And so I went and looked at a place, and I remember thinking, I could be really happy here. It was like a half a block from the ocean, and it was beautiful. It was tiny. It was like a little wedge in a little wedged lot. So it was vertical, 2 stories. And when you're in it, it was very wedge-like, but it was fantastic. It had a beautiful kitchen. It had a beautiful, beautiful spaces. And I thought, oh man, I could have like a sewing machine over there. I could have the art and craft space over there. The kids could have this room or that room. And I could be in my pajamas and take my coffee down to the ocean. And I just started to see a life for myself. And I started to come back to myself. And as I did that, I started to get off the medication, just slowly. This Alexa, I would literally with a razor blade just be. And I was so nervous about it. I mean, I looked online, you have to have a powder, you have to mix it in water. And I finally just said, look, all I know is that I can maybe just cut them this way, and I'm just going to do what makes sense to me. And I hope that's a theme here, is what makes sense to me. Because I don't know if I'd talked to a lot of principles practitioners, although I think a lot of them would have said, just do whatever you need to do. I think some of them would have been alarmed by the medication, right? So, especially for me, as someone who's, a lot of them see as like, because I'm my father's daughter, and a lot of them are my dad's generation, like as almost like a little niece or something like. So anyway, I just started coming off. And of course, as I came off the medication, and as I found my independence and my well-being, I was interacting with my husband differently. And there was a tremendous amount of anger there about the way he had handled things, about the pain he'd put our family through and our children. Like, I was very upset. And the things he thought he wanted that I didn't agree with, I didn't think they'd bring him any happiness. And frankly, they did not. But he thought he wanted them. I was angry with him for that. Just all these different things, and the way he treated me many times in this year. And I started to think to myself, I don't want to be angry. I just don't want to. And I want to be friends. And if I've known someone for this long, like, how valuable is it to have a friend of that length of time that knows me this well. So even if I get a new husband or he gets a new wife or boyfriend or girlfriend, like let's be friends. Let's be very good friends, was sort of how I started to see it. And I would slip from time to time. And that's about when he started wanting to work things out and saying, I'd like to work it out. And we'd try. And then he'd sort of have a panic attack. And, and then there was one moment, and I remember it very clearly, where he really reacted very strongly to something that I said, which again, for me, I was like, very basic stuff, but he just completely flipped out because it reminded him of maybe a dynamic from the past. And I said to him, I went back to my room in the mobile home park, and I texted him and I said, look, if you want to work things out, you can't just freak out every time something happens and say, I can't be in a relationship, I can't do it, which is what he would say, I can't be in a relationship, I can't. And I said, you're really taking this way too seriously. And it's coming from someone who took it so seriously for a year. But at this point, I was getting freed up, right? So I said, you're really taking this way too seriously. It's too heavy for you. I said, look, I'm ready to move into my own place. I'm ready to move on. So you shouldn't see it as such a big deal. Like it's fine. Everything's going to be fine. And I would sometimes say, I love you, and so then that sort of and then I remember he apologized deeply. He texted me a very long text and he said, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. It's all me. It's not you. And now in speaking with him, I understand that was a real turning point. He saw something about his own reactions. And of course, people can't see that until you stop blaming and pushing them and trying to get them to see it in any way whatsoever, right? I was already like, okay, you do whatever you need to do, and I'm moving on. I love you. Let's be friends, etc. So I'd say that was the beginning of like a real healing period for both of us. And then we went off to the mountains together for 3 days, and one thing has led to another, and we had a renewal of vows actually. I think about a month ago. Yeah. So, but the important thing about that story is that I didn't need the renewal of vows at that point. And now I'm off all of the medications. I'm back to sort of being an activist, which for me is just what feels right at this time, given the circumstances we're in politically, globally, and also with the climate crisis, which is, quite frankly, the window of opportunity we're at centimeters. We need massive, huge amounts of action by the government and by all people everywhere, or we're literally not going to make it. So I'm doing that, but also just really enjoying my family and my husband in a way that we have a relationship now that maybe we had in the very beginning, and sometimes throughout the whole course of our relationship, but it's really shifted to the positive and to reinforcing the positive, which is what I had seen right before our separation. But I guess I had to go through all of that hell to really start to understand what, quote unquote, the truth of our relationship is, which is what I had prayed for. And I don't know if I'll ever pray for anything again. I mean, I don't know. There's got to be a better way. That's all I have to say, But I'm really interested now in speaking to people in relationship, and helping to prevent this kind of very bumpy ride, and also people who are going through depression and anxiety, and are interested in taking medication or are on medication, feel badly about it, or whatever. The other thing that happened was because of the anxiety, I had a hard time sleeping, and I wanted to not use the benzos to sleep so much. So in California, they've legalized marijuana. So you can just walk into these stores now and they'll have like 1,000 products, everything from soap to shampoo to cannabis for cats and dogs to different varieties of indica and sativa and all kinds of marijuana buds and tinctures and pills and chocolates and gummy bears. If you're not in a legalized state, like it's a trip. So I went to those stores and I got tinctures. And you can get different varieties of tinctures, like in different ratios of THC and CBD. CBD is supposed to be helpful for anxiety in general, but what the CBD and the THC did for me was help me sleep. And it also brought me back to a spiritual sense. You know, like the benzos were helpful in just calming me down. But what the THC did for me, and everyone's very different, was to sort of bring back the insightful spiritual connection that I was so used to having in my life all the time before, and which I'm sort of back to now, but in the haze and fog of anxiety and depression, I had felt like I had lost. So what I want to say here is, why are these medications, these psychotropic medications that are naturally based, such as marijuana, such as, let's say, psychedelic mushrooms and LSD, which is a synthesis of a natural psychedelic compound, illegal? And MDMA, which is not coming from a natural compound, but is still something that actually opens up the capacity for compassion, love, and insight. Why are these illegal, whereas all of these other drugs made by these huge pharmaceutical companies, which may be helpful, and many of them are legal? It's insane. And I can tell you why, actually, but we don't have time to get into that. I kind of know why, but it's insane. And in fact, I will say that I was at my dear friends Bill and Linda Pettit invited me to come and stay with them for like a week, and they were teaching a workshop at that time. So I went with them and I hung out at the workshop. I didn't want to teach. They asked me to teach, and I said, no, I'm not teaching right now. Like, I don't feel qualified at this time, right? But I actually talked to, I believe, 2 people at that workshop who were on antidepressants for years and never fully kind of recovered out of depression, who took either MDMA or some form of psychedelic drug and came out of their depression, and said to me, that was sort of the key moment for me. So as far as I'm concerned, if that's what those drugs can do for people, we should be putting huge amounts of funding into research, and they should be made legal as quickly as possible. People are dying. People are suffering. And they're suffering. I just know how much they're suffering. There's no worse suffering than being in tremendous amounts of anxiety and depression. Okay, people are committing suicide. And many of these people may not have to commit suicide because these drugs could be made available to them with the proper therapeutic guidance, let's say. I mean, there are many ways to administer these drugs in, if you want to say, controlled settings. But in the meantime, I'd say, look, use your own guidance. You don't have to trust what the medical doctors say is appropriate or not. In fact, when I went to my psychiatrist, I said to him, the THC is really helping me sleep, and I recommend it. It's also helping me with my spiritual sense of things. He said, oh, well, we haven't done enough studies. I said, okay, we haven't done enough studies. Let me tell you something. I mean, people have been smoking pot all their lives at this point. There are generations who've been smoking pot for 50 years. And we don't have enough studies. And I'm just like, this is insane. It's insane.
But it's not actually true either, because there are lots of studies in Israel and lots of studies in Canada and lots of evidence of that in both of those countries.
Yeah, and so thank God for people who are doing that research against a lot of pressure not to do that research, because this is a drug you can grow in your own backyard.
Yep. Yeah.
So
Most places you get arrested for doing that, unfortunately.
I think I told the psychiatrist, look, I'll work it out. I'll work it out. Obviously, you've never smoked marijuana, so I'll work it out. I'm going on anecdotal evidence, okay? It's crazy. Anyway.
Totally. And not just for anxiety and depression, for lots of other things too. Lots of other things.
Yes, yes. And you know, I mean, I'm mindful that this is a webinar for young people too.
Yeah.
However, I would say that if we are putting young people on all kinds of psychotropic drugs, prescription drugs that are, if you look at benzodiazepines, for example, I mean, some of the pitfalls of benzodiazepines are insane, as I've looked into them on the internet, right? And doctors are very cautious about it, for sure. But to contrast that with something that really doesn't have a physical addictive capacity, it does have an emotional addictive capacity. You know, something's not right. Something's not right. And so I think we have to be mindful and thoughtful about the use of these medications. But in contrast to the other kinds of, let's say, antipsychotic medications, Valium, the benzodiazepines, Xanax, a lot of people are on actually, to not be looking at medical marijuana as an option is crazy. And also some of the other psychedelics, which I've seen reports of people in post-trauma, like veterans who've taken MDMA and done assisted therapy on MDMA, maybe 6 sessions, PTSD gone. We have a company here, I forget the name of it, but the owner of the company, it's a medical marijuana and marijuana distributor. I think they're an online company, and they distribute widely to veterans. This guy was a vet who had PTSD, and he said, actually smoking marijuana is the only time I ever felt like myself again. Right. So from a principles and that's why he started the company. He's an awesome guy. He just won an award here in our community for being like entrepreneur of the year or something. Just an awesome guy. And, you know, again, with even these psychotropic medications or psychedelic psychotropic medications, we want to be able to say, you know, also we are going to be looking at thought at the same time. Like that's not the end of the story. We bring in the principles as well, spirituality in whatever form, a sense of community, love and compassion, kindness, caring, you know, and that's the other thing I wanted to say. And I think I said it in my description on my Facebook page, was that a lot of times what we need from people when we are feeling this way isn't so much an ideology, even if it's the ideology of the principles. It's like we just need love. And Sid was very clear about that, just sharing and caring. And not like, let me teach you about the principles, which is great, you know, but I knew the principles inside and out by heart, intellectually, and also in many, many areas of my life where I had become free. But when you're in a space of depression and feeling this isolation and loneliness, like where I was, just to have someone like come and cook a meal for you or stay with you or take you to a movie, like that meant more to me. Just love. So that was a long, whew. I just got it all out there.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely to hear it though. That's, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying about just sharing what you've experienced. And actually looking back at it, it's only a year. I mean, that was a horrible year for you, but relatively speaking, a year is to go through that. So all the things that you experienced during that time are really helpful to share. Really helpful to share because it's really helpful to share the experience and say, you know, it's very easy to talk to people about, oh well, this is, you know, this is what can help when you, but if you've actually been there yourself, it's much, again, like Sid said, you share what you know, and until you know that, you can't share it. So it may have been a horrible experience to go through, but look what you're sharing now. And you wouldn't have tried those medications and you wouldn't have had that experience. And to me, that's when I first learned about the principles, I was so mad because I had spent 40 years looking for this. You know, you grew up with it, but I had spent 40 years training as a doctor, training in psychotherapy, going through one thing after another, looking for that answer. And then when I found it, it was like, why didn't you give this to me before? But I then looked back and saw, well, actually, you wouldn't have known what it felt like to go through that, or to go through that, or to go through that if you hadn't been there. So that's, and it's just amazing to hear you talking about all of that. That's, yeah, I'm sure that's helping a lot of people.
I would like to mention one person who, when I went to go stay with Bill and Linda Pettit for, it was about a week, I think. Linda just kept saying to me, and I absolutely did not believe her. She kept saying, I can see you coming through this, and then you're going to be able to use this in your teaching, and it's going to be that much more powerful. And I would look at her and say, honey, I don't think I'm going to live till, you know, next month. I did not. I would some days think about, well, how could I end this without impacting my children too much? I even had the thought of like, I'm going to go out on a kayak and it'll be like I was kayaking, but then I'll just drift out forever, you know, really. And it's interesting because I had another friend who was going through a similar time, and we were sort of helping it was interesting because I'd be very low and he would sort of say, oh, you know, you're going to make it. And then I'd do the same for him, you know. So it's just, I have this, I don't know if you can see it. Let me just grab it real quickly. Sometimes I would look at this little sculpture thingy, I guess it's a sculpture, and think that this is what was happening. That I was like Winnie the Pooh. And these are all the people I've met along the way and who are my good dear friends like Linda Pettit and Bill, who I'm trying to think of others. There were a lot of people I spoke with. Keith and Val the Blevins, I'll say. Joe Bailey, and who's the guy? Oh shoot, Ken Manning. The people at the Center for Spiritual Living, the pastor Alice Reed, and my roommate, who I'm not going to name because she's an introvert, so she doesn't like to be out front and center. And Sky Leona, I'm just going to say, and I said Elisha Christopher already. Yeah.
At which point did you start using the cannabis oil, or what did you say? You had a. At which point did you start using that for your sleeping? Because you said that.
Probably about halfway into taking the medication. Okay. Because I was thinking about if I start to come off of it, especially the benzos, then I was reading about how people can't sleep. And that was my problem to begin with, is I wasn't sleeping. I had this energy in my body all the time that I was sort of like, a little bit OCD. I'd be sort of tying up and I'd be walking into one room and but then I'd get distracted and be tidying, and then I'd get distracted by something else. And this is what my kids were dealing with. And that's why I got on the meds, actually, because I felt like I needed to just calm down for them. So about halfway through, when I started to feel like I'd like to experiment with coming off of some of these gradually, and then I went, and we're just so lucky that we can walk into really these beautiful boutiques. It's crazy. If you need some, come to California. I don't know if you could take it back on the plane, but you could hang out for a while. And you can get like a 2-to-1 tincture or a 20-to-1 tincture, and that's parts of THC as opposed to cannabis, or as opposed to CBD. So that means the THC at 20-to-1, I'm sorry, it's CBD first and then THC. So 20-to-1 means a very 1 part THC to 20 parts CBD, which is not psychoactive. And then you can go 10-to-1, and you can go 2-to-1. So it's really nice to be able to just experiment, and have those different levels. But the other thing that I'm seeing is that in the rush to recreationally sell these drugs or sell marijuana, there's been a sort of a bypass of the medical piece, which is so important for people with everything from epilepsy to cancer to anxiety. And I think we need to, if I have any say in anything, which I generally don't, I would just say that, for people to really make sure that doctors and medical practitioners are around and available and are studying what the effects are, so that they can be a guide for people. And I actually went to a Women's and Men's Alliance for Medical Marijuana, which was the first organization here in Santa Cruz County that really pushed for medical legalization. And this was years ago, 20 years ago. And they have a doctor who will sit with you for like an hour for $50 and talk to you, and then give you a medical prescription. And so that was a real blessing, and thank God for them, because not that I really needed it, but I just thought, I want to go. I was interested also, that journalistic mind of mine wanted to know, well, what's out there, and how come if I go into a dispensary here, which are the legal shops, and I asked them about anxiety and I asked them about depression, they're kids. They're just salespeople. They just don't know. They're just retail clerks, right? I mean, they have some experience with it themselves, but they're not doctors. And we need to have the seriousness of doctors and medical people and their background behind these psychotropics that really, really can really work for people. And not every person, and different. I was just talking to an acupuncturist, is very studied, accomplished person, who was saying every brain is different. So every brain's going to react differently to different strands of THC and different, whether it's indica or sativa. And so we just need to put, just more energy on this, and positive, thoughtful energy.
And to combine it with an understanding of how our experience works, like with the principles too.
Absolutely, yes. And I said that, and thank you for repeating it, because because now I'm not really using any of those substances, right? So and I'm happy and I'm fine, and I'm dealing with some very serious issues like climate change, and I'm able to meet people, young people, who are incredibly anxious about the future and upset and going through grief. And I mean, really, I don't know if people understand how the young people who actually are paying attention to the science and these non-linear feedback loops happening in the Arctic right now, people are psychologically struggling, which is understandable, because we're looking at, seriously, it sounds so odd to say it, but we're looking at extinction, not just of species, but of the human species.
In fact, that was one of the main reasons. That was one of the main reasons why I started this. The Secret of Everything, because I had seen that over the last year. I had seen exactly what you're seeing, and about what's happening in the world, and that the young people are getting very anxious about it, and for good reason. But
Absolutely.
at the same time, what you're talking about is a is a way of helping with that, because if you just get anxious, it you can't deal with it. You can't deal with it. So if you're understanding where our experience comes from, and how we can deal with our feelings, and how we can deal with our experience, and how we understand our experience, then it's going to be much more effective
Yes.
doing something about it. That's my that's where I was coming from in
And there's a very interesting intersection now between people who are in the spiritual world, like Joanna Macy, and Buddhists and others. As far as I know, I'm the only person from the principles community that I know of, and I'm not saying that they aren't out there, that are starting to look at the ecological crisis, emergency crisis situation that we're in, and try to help from a spiritual perspective. And so that's, I think, something that's very needed. And I see that there's is this Judy here on with us? And she says, thanks so much, Amy and Anne, so validating for me, and still struggle with, yes.
Do you want to speak, Judy? And you've got you've got to unmute yourself if you want to. You want to unmute? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say thank you, because your honesty and vulnerability around sharing what you've shared has really touched me. And for so long I've sort of felt like, well, there must be something I'm not getting, and I've had people tell me that well, you're just not, that you're missing something. And so I kind of felt like there was something wrong with me still. So yeah, to hear your story is actually really, really nice. Thank you.
You know, we're in this together. We are in this together, and we are all going to stumble and fall. And there may be things we're not getting. There are things I'm sure not getting. But so what? Like that, what does that even mean? To say you're not getting it or I'm not getting it, that's just so irrelevant. What's relevant is what in this moment, in this moment is called for. Whether it's medication, or whether it's finding community, or whether it's crying, weeping, falling to the floor, to think there are any rules around how to be in depression or anxiety, or how to start to come out of it, is to make a mistake. There's only this sense of a little positivity around something, whether that's taking, for me, it was taking a medication. It was moving out, getting a room, going to a church, going to get marijuana products. And I did actually have a lot of thinking about, this is not 3 principles. This is so far from 3 principles. And to be honest, if you really listen to Sydney Banks, I don't think he's ever said there was a particular way. And that's the problem with all the spiritual traditions that become a little bit ossified. The problem is they all become ossified. That's just what happens. But if the good ones at any rate will be pointing us back to this very organic, whether it's bit by bit, step by step. I used to say to myself, I feel like I'm going 2 steps forward. I'd tell my roommate 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back, right? And she didn't even know what I was going through. In fact, when I told her later about this idea to take a kayak out to the ocean, she was shocked. She did not know. I would lie in bed sometimes and just be like, my mind would just be spinning. So I just don't think there are any rules.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think that having experienced what you've said, I agree with Linda. Ultimately, you'll likely look back and think what a gift that was, that I can help so many more people.
Well, that would be a really that would be the greatest gift.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments and for being on the call. Well, you're the only one we have. So you're very valuable. But Anne, if I can help you with this, because I am so busy, and it'd be nice to have something, if this turns out well, to that I could just maybe put up on the Facebook or on the YouTube or something, because it just would help me so much. I have so little time. My next step is Extinction Rebellion Santa Cruz. That's where I'm going, and I got to be there in half an hour. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's been totally unexpected. Really, really lovely. Yeah, very good, and totally in line with why I started this. So fantastic. Thank you very much. And yeah, we definitely will be sharing this some more.
Okay, will you be in London?